there's Frost as a young man. And I should tell you that Robert Frost, although we're taking him up as a New England poet, and he certainly was, Frost was born in San Francisco, and it was only after his father died that his mother moved him back to Massachusetts. And then he was a teacher and he was a farmer in New Hampshire. And at some point, when he was not a young man, he was in his late 30s, maybe 40, uh, he inherited the farm he was working on, and he sold the farm and used the money to go to England. And it was in England, in middle age, that he became the poet that we know and read. And I want to talk a little about him as a poet in England. This is Frost and his family. There's Frost, the older man. And I suggested all of you might want to read or look at the YouTube of Kennedy's inauguration and Robert Frost reading. Not everyone is old enough to remember that inauguration, but I saw it on television. It was the first time a poet read at the inauguration of an American president. It's become usual ever since. And John Kennedy asked Robert Frost to read. And if you looked at that video, Frost, the glare is great, and Frost has this dedicatory poem and he can't read it. And somebody puts a hat up and he can't read it. And Lyndon Johnson goes to help him. And Jackie Kennedy is looking with consternation. And Frost decides to read the poem that he really wanted to read, which he knew by heart, which is called The Gift Outright. And I actually won't talk so much about this. It's just out of that sense that he was a preeminent figure. And as Walter Cronkite says at the end of that excerpt, if we had a national poet, it would be Robert Frost. And Frost is seen as this white-haired, genial guy. In fact, I think he was white-haired, but he wasn't so genial. So this poem, as I wrote you, is it looks like a sonnet, but it's not. It's 16 lines long, and it's unrhymed. And I'll just read it and intersperse a few comments. The land, that's America, was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. So the first colonies were in the very early 1600s, and in about 1660, England bought Manhattan and New York from the Dutch, and Charleston was settled. So 100 years before he's reading it, more than 100 years before he's reading at the inauguration, the land was occupied by new people. And the interesting thing about this poem is he does not acknowledge the Native Americans who lived here. And in fact, he talks part of the way through about how the land was made ours by wars. And part of the wars were against the British and part were wars of appropriation. She was our land. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts and Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by, possessed but by what we now know more possessed. And complicated language there, but all those possessings means the land still didn't have a claim on us. We were not Americans, we were colonials, and we were possessed by an England that was no longer ours. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. So amazing, we won by losing ourselves to the land. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war, not only the revolution, but the battles and the Spanish and American War, but the battles against the so-called Indians who we took the land from. It was not unoccupied when the land became, quote, in the words of this poem, ours. To the land vaguely, realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. So that's a kind of prologue. And no secrets. I'm going to talk about three aspects of Frost as we go through, so I thought I'd put them up here. One is I think there's a a radical skepticism in Frost. I've had difficulties on how Frost is a modernist. He writes such conventional seeming verse. Well, I think there are three ways in which he is a modernist. The third of them, symbolism, is a continuity from the 19th century, which in the second half was very much of a symbolist era, but he was a symbolist in a new kind of way. And it's hard for me to put my finger on it. He is, and you'll see this in several of the poems, a radical skeptic. He does not believe in certainty that things are there, that we can know the world, that we can be certain of what is going on around us. And I would connect this up to the 20th century and its great intellectual movement. I think it was through physics that we human beings discovered that things were relative to one another, that the only thing that was constant in a world where things seemed to be really there was the speed of light. And that's what Einstein discovered. And then a Danish physicist came along named Niels Bohr, and he talked about something called complementarity, which is you could either see the world as a bunch of particles, kind of Einsteinian universe in which the particles did things, or you could see it as waves of energy. That's quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and you couldn't do both at the same time. So the world was a little unknowable, and then that was put into a theorem. It was a mathematical theorem by Werner Heisenberg, and the uncertainty principle, which basically said that you couldn't measure the speed and position of an electron, right? If you measured the speed, it changed its position. If you measured the position, you changed its speed. So all of this meant that the world was, in the 20th century, to those who dealt with the most important level of things, the world was in some ways unknowable. And I think we'll find that in Frost. And in that way, he's very modern. And the other is he experimented a lot with verse forms. Here is the most famous dictum of poetic modernism, and it may be the most famous guideline to how to approach modernism, period. And that was Ezra Pound's three words, make it new. It was the title of a book of essays in the 1930s. But really that idea of making things new, that either this is true of fiction because the language didn't work anymore. It led people to slaughter each other in the First World War for reasons they knew not whereof, or because the 19th century wrote itself into a corner. There was an attempt to make things new. And you can think of not only poets, but you think of Picasso and Braque and Matisse in painting. You could think about music. I'm very taken with and don't understand the music of Arnold Schoenberg, who decided that the 19th century had gone as far as it could go in tonality, and we had to reinvent the language of music. And so he came up with serial technique and 12-tone rows. And poets wanted to make it new. And Robert Frost, much to our amazement, doesn't make the language new, as you'll find Wallace Stevens does, and I think as William Carlos Williams, there his contemporaries did. And here's a quote that he said in a talk in Pennsylvania, and then he repeated it again and again. This is from a newspaper. He said he likened free verse, which he said he never writes, to playing tennis without a net or handball without a wall. So that's the famous saying from Frost. Writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. So his poems are going to rhyme. But as you will see, and I sent this to you so you don't have to try and read all this at once, of the poems we're reading, there are two that are kind of tell a little bit of a story, Out, and Birches, and they're in blank verse. So he wrote in the Shakespearean iambic pentameter. But all the rest are, they use different rhyme schemes. And sonnets are a sonnet is 14 lines, he sometimes writes 16 lines or 15 lines or uses strange rhyme schemes. No two are the same. And I think that relentless attempt to try and make the way the sounds in the poem move differently was his way of making it new. He took the old verse forms and tried to give them new life. So let's plunge right in. This is probably his second most famous poem. His most famous poem is the one that they teach in high school, and it's a good poem, but we're not doing it. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. There I stood. It's called The Road Not Taken, and they teach it in high school. High school students go bananas over it because the poem actually talks to them. You make choices, and you make a choice, and built on that is another choice, and you can't go back again. So this is his other really well-known poem, and it's a strange poem. It's about stopping by the woods, and here's woods on a snowy evening. It's not evening in this photo, but this is what the poem is going to be about. And the speaker of the poem this is an early time, is in a horse-drawn sleigh. So he's drawn by a horse, and the horse will dominate stanzas 2 and 3. It's not a car. And the woods he is looking at are not just any old woods. They're a plot of woods owned by somebody in town. So let's look at actually the rhyme scheme first. It's what I would call a modified terza rima. That is, terza rima goes A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C. Each middle line of the 3-line stanza becomes the lines of the first and last lines of the next stanza. And we'll get one of those later, but this goes, so the A rhyme here, we label in looking at lines, the rhymes by a letter, right? So no and though and snow rhyme, and the third line is here, and it will turn out to be the first and second and fourth line of the second stanza, queer near year. And lake here will become the first and second and fourth line of the next stanza. Shake, mistake, flake, and sweep is here, and it becomes the line of the last stanza, although in this stanza, all of the lines rhyme. And in fact, if you're attentive, you don't have to be very attentive, the last 2 lines rhyme identically with each other. And miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The same words all the way through. Every single word rhymes with the next line. So let's look at stopping by woods. I hope everybody got that. We'll talk about rhyme schemes in a lot of poems, because I think it is one of the characteristics of Frost's poetry, is that he's always trying to innovate. He's always trying to push himself to do something new. Whose woods these are, I think I know. Somebody owns these woods, but he's stopping here. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not mind my stopping here. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So he's stopping by woods on a snowy evening, and he's stopping and watching the snow drift down into the woods, and the woods are filling up with snow. But it's someone else's woods, and that person lives in the village. We see that in the second line. His house is in the village, though. And it turns out in these central 2 stanzas 2 and 3, even the horse says, wait a minute, how come you're stopping here? I want to get back to my barn where there's going to be hay and oats, and I want to have the snow landing on my flanks. I'll be out of the weather. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. And I would point out, it's really those middle stanzas are about the horse who says, why are you stopping here in the middle of nowhere? And he's already told us it's not his woods, and he shouldn't be stopping here, maybe. And I love the sweep there because it has this onomatopoetic, that is, it sounds like what it's describing, the sound of the wind sweeping by. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. And then he says, the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I have a story to tell about this poem, actually, two aspects of the poem. It's a long ago story. Everybody has stories about Frost. I have a story about Frost. When I was a teenager, I fell in love with Robert Frost. My mother, bless her, took me to hear him read at the 100th anniversary of Rabindranath Tagore, who was a famous Indian poet, actually won a Nobel Prize for Literature. And quite a remarkable poet. And all I remember of that lecture of Frost is that he said that Rabindranath Tagore was ineffable. I didn't know what ineffable meant, but it turns out ineffable means you can't say anything about it. So he didn't really have anything to say about Rabindranath Tagore. So he read some of his poems, including this one. And the first thing I have to tell you is I can still remember. It's amazing how our minds work. I can still remember how he read the final stanza. The words, the rhythm of those words resounds in my ear. And it was not like I had thought one would read it. The final two lines being different from one another, the second reading of the same words being more somehow final and assertive. No, he read it. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, and I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Those two lines were read the same way. Well, after the reading, there was I guess you'd call it a green room, then back room to Town Hall in Manhattan, where we had traveled to hear him, and people were lining up to get the autograph of Robert Frost, and I got there and I said, "Do you sign my program?" He said, "No, I only sign my own works." Son of a bitch. So I got on the line, and other people had books of Robert Frost, and he signed their books. And I scribbled in the corner, and I went back in line, and I said, "Would you sign this?" And he said, "I think I told you I only sign my own works." And I said, "This is your own works." And I read him the last stanza, which I knew by heart. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And he kind of smiled at me and he signed it. So that's my Robert Frost story, that he wouldn't sign any works, anything that wasn't his works, but when somebody came with a poem of his, he signed it. Now, I mentioned that Frost is a symbolic poet, and this is difficult for me to discuss because I don't know if I deal with symbolism very well. I'm not sure any of us deals with symbolism very well. There is a contrast in this poem between the woods, which are natural and lovely and dark and deep, and the neighbor who lives in town. It's between nature and society, between the woods and civilization, between social expectations, which are going to come up in the last stanza, and I have promises to keep, and individual desire, which is he wants to just stop there and do nothing and look at the woods filling up with snow. So that this poem is built on this contrast, which it does not resolve. And the horse seems to be, you think, a natural creature on the side of the social. And then he says in the final stanza, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And nobody has any problem, I think, with the promises. We have promises. We have to do things. We owe people things. We ought to do things. You remember from Emily Dickinson, she talks about being at a funeral, a wooden way, regardless grown. No, she says, the feet mechanical go round of ground or air or ought. A wooden way, regardless grown. That ought, that we ought to do things are the promises we have. That we have said we do. So the promises are not hard. And the fact that we have a lot of mileage ahead of us is not hard. Emily Dickinson says it in one of her poems. We also did this. There may be miles and miles of naught. We just may have to go through a lot of miles to get to the destination, which is, I guess, in that poem, death. But here we don't know what to make of the woods are lovely, dark, and deep. And that's why I think they're symbolic. Some people have read it as this is a poem about a longing for death, and other people have read it as this is a longing for individualism and surrendering to his own desires to look at the woods. And some have, I mean, there are many ways to look at it, but that lovely, dark, and deep, and especially that dark, I don't think it's spelled out by the poem. I think Frost leaves it symbolic, what that loveliness and darkness and deepness of the woods, what that is up to us to figure out, and that it's symbolic in the sense that there can be different ways to say what that line represents. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, and I don't think there's any final representation. It's a little like, is it an electron or is it a quantum of energy? We don't know. It depends how we read it. This poem I'll preface with a experience I had. One of the most searing experiences in 50 years of teaching was when I had a doctor who, in retirement, decided he would take a course, and he took a poetry course. I taught an introductory poetry course. And when this poem was over, he said, that is the most horrible poem I ever read. Something about a lifetime spent trying to take care of people really rebelled against this poem. But the poem is it's a reflection on what life is and how things just keep going on. It comes, obviously, the title of the poem is in quotes. It comes from an allusion to one of the most famous of Shakespeare's soliloquies. This is from Macbeth in Act 5, Scene 5. And Macbeth says, he knows things are going badly for him. He says, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Life is just a lot of noise. And it has no rationale. It's a tale told by an idiot. And it doesn't mean anything. And candles just go out, just like players play their parts on the stage and then disappear because the play is over. So it's about the transience of life and the inaccessibility of meaning. It's a wonderful soliloquy. So here it is in New England in a farmyard. And the farmyard, what's happening is that several people, you'll see that there's a boy and his sister and somebody else. They're cutting big logs as here into stovewood sized pieces, and then they'll split them later, and they're cutting them with what's called a buzz saw. That's a buzz saw. And he'll talk about the sounds of the buzz saw 3 times in the poem. And there's the belt that runs the saw. When the saw is cutting the wood, the saw is snarling, and when it rattled, if some of you go to the county fairs in Vermont, you can see these old saws, and the motor sputters along, and the back belt rattles. So we had in that onomatopoetic line, which is repeated 3 times in the first part of the poem, we have the sound of the saw. And he will also say, it's also true for people in our part of the woods, Vermont, New Hampshire. I think this may be a New Hampshire poem. 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont. So he's looking at the sunset, and the sun is setting in the west. And so maybe he's looking from New Hampshire at the Green Mountains of Vermont. So it's called Out. The reference, as I said, the allusion is to Macbeth. And wonderful, wonderful, wonderful snarled and rattled, which you see here, and then you'll see it here. And if you missed it, then you'll see it here. And it's onomatopoetic. It sounds like the saw. The buzz saw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. You can smell the freshly cut wood. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont. And the saw snarled and rattled as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. So they're just sawing up the wood. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. He's just a kid, and he's going to repeat that later in the poem just below. Give him a little extra time for himself. He doesn't have to work all the time. Let him play catch with himself, throw a ball in the air, or let him just wander around and draw with a stick in the dirt. He's a kid. Let him do childish things. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside them in her apron to tell them supper. So she's calling them to dinner. At the word, the saw, as if to prove Saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. And this, we'll see, is characteristic. We're going to see the same thing happen again in the poem Birches. Frost corrects himself. It's like the saw seemed to know it's time to eat, and it ate the saw goes and eats the hand. But no, he must have given the hand. He didn't pay attention for a minute, turned around, it was supper time, and the saw cut his hand off. However it was, neither refused the meeting, neither saw in their hand, but the hand. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep his life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know big boy doing a man's work. Though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. So he's holding up his hand, and the laugh is rueful, and half in appeal, please help me, and half, oh my God, it's bleeding. I gotta keep it from bleeding. Have to keep his life from spilling. And he knows that life is never going to be the same. He's never going to be able to play baseball. He's never going to be able to handle things well again. His arm is damaged forever. And so he says, he saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. And this, to me, astonishing sentence. So, it's the whole of it. So, one word. So, but the hand was gone already. And a doctor comes and he tries to sew it up, I suppose, and he gives him ether to knock him out. But the doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. So I said, my friend, the doctor who read this poem, couldn't believe that life could be so callous. They would just go on to their duties. They would have dinner, milk the cows. The boy is dead, but they had stuff to do. And I think it's the fact that Frost sets this in such a believable setting that troubles us so much, trouble my friend Arthur so much, because there's another poem, almost the same poem, but it's artsier. It takes place in a museum. It references great painters. It talks about a specific painting, but it tells the same thing. And this is one of the great poems of the 20th century. This is called Musée de Beaux-Arts by W.S. Auden. And it's about a painting. You can see it here, landscape with the fall of Icarus. There's a plowman. There's a shepherd looking up. He's got a flock there looking up into the sky. There's a beautiful painted ship. And there's Icarus drowning. It's called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. And there's the sun setting there and lighting up the sky. And I think you all know the story of Icarus. Icarus had a father whose name was Daedalus. He was a great craftsman, and he built wings for Icarus and said, you can fly wherever you want. The only thing you have to do, just do this. Don't go too close to the sun, because I stuck the feathers onto your arms with wax, and the wax will melt. And of course, Icarus is not too smart. He's a kid. He says, I don't care what my father says. And he flies close to the sun, the wax melts, and he falls to his death. So there's Icarus right there. You can see him in the poem. It's a beautiful poem. It says that it tells us the same thing as Frost. But the difference in tone is so great. Frost is so down to earth in his poem. He brings us right into the farmyard that we are stunned by it. And this is a wonderful poem. I love this poem. I don't think it's artsy at all. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. And he's talking about the old master painters, but maybe about people of long ago who understood this, how well they understood its human position, how suffering, takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not especially want it to happen. They're awaiting a great birth, and kids just go on and do their things. Skating on a pond at the edge of a wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Masterful lines. The dogs go on with their doggy life. While someone is suffering a martyrdom, the dogs sniff at the scent of urine and feces, and they go on with it, and they hump each other. They go on with their doggy life, and the horse, which carried the executioner there, just scratches its behind on a tree. It scratches its innocent behind on a tree. As you will notice, I put this down here. It's almost a sonnet. I mean, he learned something from Frost, I think. And it goes, this is the rhyme scheme here, and it's incomplete. And so instead of a last line, he gives us another octave, another 8-line stanza, the first half of the sonnet. And he's going to talk about the plowman looking down and the exquisitely painted ship and the sun shining as it had to. And off in the corner here is Icarus drowning. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. And this has a rhyme scheme, which I've shown you at the bottom. I think he learned from Frost that you can play around with the old forms. Maybe he didn't learn it from Frost. But here again is that painting of the boy dying and the world continuing on, which is what the Frost poem is about. But the Frost poem is so present to us. We are so much in that farmyard that we are stunned and staggered by it in a way perhaps that we are not by Auden's poem. Now we come to two of my very favorite Frost poems. This one is called For Once Then Something. And I'm going to get my copy of it because my line is covered up here. It's about a man looking into a well and people laughing at him. You stupid, you always look the wrong way. All you ever see is the surface of the water deep in the well. And it reflects back to you your own face. And around the well head where he's looking around the well curb are ferns are growing there because it's moist from the well, and so there are little ferns up there, and above him is the sky with clouds in it. So he looks in the well, and what he sees, and this is what Frost is telling us, what we see if we look for something deeply, what we mostly see is ourself. Others taunt me with having knelt at well curbs, always wrong to light, so never seeing deeper down in the well than where the water gives me back in a shining surface picture, me, myself, in the summer heaven godlike looking out from a wreath of fern and cloud puffs. You all have that picture. He's looking into the well, and what he sees in the surface of the well in the water is a reflection of himself, and above him the sky and the clouds, and around him the green ferns. One time, when trying with a chin against a well curb, I discerned, as I thought, beyond the picture, through the picture, as something white, uncertain, something more of the depths. Once I saw something underneath it all, something white. And then, damn it, a drop of water came off one of those ferns, and there were ripples, and I couldn't see it anymore. And then I lost it. Water came to rebuke the too clear water. One drop fell from the fern, and lo, a ripple shook whatever it was, lay there at bottom, blotted it out. What was that whiteness that he saw, right? I discerned, I thought, as beyond the picture, something white, uncertain. What was that? Truth? As we look into the depths. A pebble, of course, just a thing out there and nothing, or maybe material reality, I don't know. For once, then, something. So we're left with an awareness of that there's something, but we don't know what it is. Here is the rhyme scheme of that poem, which is pretty astonishing. Right? It begins A, B, C, D, and look, we have an A, curb and curb, a B, which is seeing, and it's going to be the last line, something and seeing, rhyme. C is water, is going to go to water, and an internal rhyme here. D is picture, another internal line, picture. Godlike looking is a internal slant rhyme. Rebuke and ripple, rhyme together. The it rhymes with the it over here. I mean, there are repetitions in sound that are rhymes and internal rhymes that are pretty amazing. And ripple and pebble have a kind of rhyme to them. Ripple, pebble, and the alliteration of bottom, blotted it, also is a kind of rhyme. So this is Frost, who is experimenting with sounds in something. It's one line more than a sonnet, and the rhyme is irregular, as I wrote to you, but it is a rhyme. And the poem, as we read it, is about looking hard at the world, deep at the world, trying to ascertain what's beneath the surface of things, seeing only the reflection of ourselves. And once intuiting maybe there's something more, but it disappears. And what was it? Truth, a pebble of quartz for once, then something. So the indeterminacy of what is there, that skepticism about whether there's anything beyond the reflection of ourself, is, I think, in line, as I said, with what the physicists of the 20th century were also trying to do with. Here's a poem called The Oven Bird, and I'm going to show you some pictures of oven birds. If you take nothing else from this poem, you might want to write this down. There's a website called Merlin, Merlin. You can download it on your phone or on your computer. It's better on your phone. And if you click on it, it comes from Cornell University Ornithology, and I don't think it tracks you or anything, but I can't promise. If you say you see a bird and it's small and it's white and gray, it'll give you 4 or 5 different choices, one of which may be a chickadee, which is probably what it is. And not only that, it will give you the sound of those birds. I was once I sent this poem to the guy who I met. I was in a state park in West Virginia with my wife and my son. We're hiking. We ran to people doing a bird census, and we said, but we don't see any birds. They said it doesn't matter. We recognize them by their songs. So for people in this class who are birders, like I know Clem is and Judith is, it's amazing. You can tell the birds by their songs, and Merlin will help you do that. So I hope all of you download Merlin. Here's the ovenbird, which lives in Vermont. A friend of mine told me, oh, I have an ovenbird nest outside my house. Tiny little bird. It's called an ovenbird because it builds nests on the ground. You see here is the eggs inside the nest, and the nest looks like a little oven. And here's the ovenbird inside its nest. Robert Frost uses mathematical ratios in this poem, and you would think they wouldn't belong in a poem, but he pulls it off. He's just amazing. There's a singer everyone has heard, loud a midsummer and a midwood bird, who makes the solid tree trunk sound again. Right? So he's singing this bird, this ovenbird, is a summer bird, and he sings in the middle of the woods. And in the middle of the summer, when the other birds which sing to mate have sang in the spring, who makes the solid tree trunks sound again. He says that leaves are old and that for flowers midsummer is the spring as 1 to 10. Oh my goodness, we got a ratio here. It's like on a college board exam. The flowers of spring are to the flowers of summer like 1 is to 10. Or like 10 is to 1. As there are 10 times as many flowers in the spring as there are in the summer. Midsummer is 1 and spring is 10, right? So everybody follow that ratio. He says beautiful lines. He said, the early petal fall is past when pear and cherry bloom went down in showers on sunny days, a moment overcast. And what he's thinking of is these white flowers on cherry trees and pear trees. And when the flower's been there long enough, and all of a sudden the cloud comes off of frozen arches, he says in another poem, a cloud comes overhead and the wind stirs up a little bit. The flowers fall, and it's almost like a snowfall. He doesn't say that here, but the flowers are falling. The petals are falling in this dropping of the white petals. So wonderful poem by Osip Mandelstam about the petal fall from pear trees. Should have brought it. And comes that other fall, we name the fall. He says, the highway dust is over all. And so there's a period here. I read that wrongly. And comes that other fall, we name the fall. So that's the fall of the year when leaves fall from the tree. But I think he's being elusive here. The fall of man and woman from the Garden of Eden in the first book of the Bible. You remember what God says? He expels them and he says, dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. So we have the dust, the highway dust. Now it is summer in the poem. Right? The line works 2 ways. It's summer and the leaves are out and there are no more flowers or hardly any flowers, none on the trees. And there's highway dust over everything because this is a dirt road. But he's also alluding to the fall, not only of the year, but the fall of man and woman. He has a famous short poem, nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaves of flower, but only so an hour. So dawn goes down to day. So Eden second, let me do it. I think I got the line mixed up. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaves of flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, So Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. So it's about the transience of things, the fall of not only the year and of the flowers, but the fall of man and woman. So dawn goes down today, so Eden sank to grief. So comes that other fall, we name the fall, he says the highway dust is over all. The bird would cease and be as other words, and this is the line that explodes in the poem, but that he knows in singing not to sing. And I think that line depends on the two ways we can read the word sing. Sing is to sing a song, the bird sings its song, but to sing is also to celebrate. I sing the body electric, says Walt Whitman, and he's not talking about singing a song, although he'll tell it in a poem, but he's talking about celebrating it. That he knows in singing not to celebrate, but that he knows in singing not to sing. The question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing. I love this poem because I think that's the lives we live, are diminished things. The glory of youth is gone. The glory of innocence is gone as we've encountered the messiness of the world, which we'll come to in the poem Burgess, that life is too much like a pathless wood, where branches kind of go across our eyes. We're crying from having our eyes gouged. Life is a diminishment. We go downwards to darkness, as well as Stevens will say in a famous poem. And what Frost is saying to us is the oven bird is our guide. How can we sing and not celebrate, but still endure? The question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing. It's hard to know how to go on with diminishment. And yet that's, Frost suggests, what the oven bird tells us in his song, that we need to figure out how to deal with diminishment. Here's another New England poem. These have all been, I think, New England poems about snow in the woods. All of these poems are going to be New England poems, except for the last one, Once by the Pacific. This is called The Need of Being Versed in Country Things. And what is interesting in this is the imagery in the poem, so I'm going to show it to you. I once, long ago, saw, actually it was a barn burning, but 60 years ago I saw a barn burning in Vermont. Here's a house burning. That's going to happen in the poem. And in the very first lines of the poem, he's going to say, the sky that was wonderfully colored and bright in the sunset is going to have a second sunset as the flames light up the night sky. So the house is going to burn, and he's going to say all that will remain is a chimney, like a pistol. Here's the pistol right here, standing up when all the petals have fallen off. The chimney remains when the house is burned down. And here's an abandoned barn. He's going to say next to the house is a barn. And because the wind didn't blow towards it, but away from it, the barn is there and still remains, but it's abandoned as this barn is. And he's going to talk about these open windows, which birds fly in and out of. He's going to talk, these are lines in the poem, about how in its earlier days, the barn housed the hay that the teams brought in for teams that came by the stony road to drum on the floor with scarring hoofs and brush with mow, the summer load. So there's a hay mow which is going to be put in the barn. And then the poem goes on to say that even though the house is burned down and the barn remains with broken windows, for what remains, and especially the birds that remain, the phoebes, every spring the lilacs, and you can see them in Vermont, they grow up around where there are abandoned homesteads. For them, the lilac renewed its leaf, and I love the idea that the scorched elms also kept growing, so I put a bunch of Elms here is an elm tree from Vermont in the early 1900s. For those of you who, like me, live in Burlington, here's College Street when it had elms in it. And then we had this horrible Dutch elm disease, and they all died. At the end, the top of the street is Old Mill. There's Old Mill right there, and there's Williams Science Hall, and you can see the elms there. And here's a Phoebe, and here, if I can do this right, you can hear what you yourself can get. There's the Phoebe, and let me play its song. So it's going to hear the song of the Phoebe, and it's called a Phoebe because it sounds like, its name sounds like the song Phoebe, Phoebe. Okay, so I'm gonna, oh, there's the Phoebe, who's also going to be in this poem. So they have all the elements in the poem. I didn't copy in here. There's a pump handle that's up. The pump has been abandoned, used to provide water to the house. And there's a strand of barbed wire, and the birds rest on that. And the rhyme scheme of this poem, which will go on through the whole poem, is A, B, C, B. So one, the second line and the fourth line will rhyme of every stanza, and there'll be no continuity from one stanza to the next. This poem then is written in quatrains, in 4-line stanzas. The house had gone to bring again to the midnight sky a sunset glow. Now the chimney was all of the house that stood like a pistol after the petals go. We saw pictures of that, right? The house and it burning and setting the sky alight again, and the chimney standing. And there's a simile like a pistol after the petals go. The barn opposed across the way that would have joined the house in flame, had it been the will of the wind, was left to bear forsaken the place's name. So all that remains is the barn broken down. And of course, since nobody lives in the house anymore, nobody tends to the barn, and it's forsaken, as he says here. No more it opened with all one end for teams that came by the stony road to drum on the floor with scurrying hoofs and brush the mow with the summer load. The birds that came to it, to the barn, through the air at broken windows flew out and in, their murmur more like the sigh we sigh from too much dwelling on what has been. So that sound of the birds, which are the Phoebes, sounds like us going, oh God, those people, their house burned down and they moved away, and it's an abandoned place. And then this pretty amazing end. Again, the countryside that Frost is going to set his poems in. He's thinking along with Einstein that maybe things aren't so certain. And we just see me, myself, as he says in that well poem, for once then something. That's all we see is ourselves. We don't see that maybe nature is different than us. Yet for them, for the birds, the lilac renewed its leaf, and the aged elm, though touched with fire, also renewed its leaf. And the dry pump flung up an awkward arm, it's there for the birds, and the fence post carried a strand of wire. For them, there was really nothing sad, but though they rejoiced in the nest they kept, one had to be versed in country things not to believe the Phoebes wept. And again, it's this sense, we had that in Out, I think. The sense that the human world, like my doctor friend, wants one thing, and the world goes in a very different direction. The birds don't mourn at all. Life goes on. Destruction, the house burning down, happens, and the birds, there was really nothing sad, as he says here, and they rejoiced. But we think maybe they wept. And I just want to, this may be overly much and a little too literary. I'm just going to check the time here. This is from probably the great novel of the 19th century, Moby Dick. And there's a chapter called The Whiteness of the Whale, in which Ishmael thinks, though in many of its aspects this visible world seems formed in love, the invisible spheres were formed in fright. And this next poem is going to be about a whiteness that is an indefiniteness. It shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us through from behind with the thought of annihilation. Whiteness makes us think that everything is going to be annihilated, according to Melville. Whiteness is not so much a color of the as a visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors. Is it for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness full of meaning in whiteness? So whiteness is in this poem going to be not pure and nice, but terrifying. And this poem is called Desert Places. It's in 4 quatrains, and they all rhyme the same way, and they don't connect up like the 4 quatrains of Stopping by Woods. So fast past snow last, and then the next rhymes are different rhymes. Theirs, layers, count, unawares. There's no continuity of rhymes. He's as I say, he loves to play with the possibilities of rhyme. Snow falling and night falling fast, oh fast. It's a pretty amazing line, isn't it? Right? I mean, look at all the rhymes in that first line. Falling and falling. Fast and fast. In a field I looked into going past, and the ground almost covered smooth in snow, but a few weeds and stubble showing last. For those of you who are in Vermont, it's turning dark outside now, but this afternoon, unless you got a lot of snow, and you probably didn't, you could see the stubble of the hayfield and the weeds that haven't been beaten down because we haven't had a lot of snow. They're poking up through the snow. The snow is, it's not a level whiteness because the snow is still coming down. It's falling and falling fast. The woods around it, around the snowy field, have it is theirs. It's all part of the natural world. No person owning it, as in that first poem we looked at, his house is in the village though. The woods around it have it is theirs. All animals are smothered in their lairs. I am too absent-spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares. And this line is a very strange one. I am too absent-spirited to count. I think we'll understand it better when we get to the end of the poem. And lonely as it is, that loneliness will be more lonely, it will be less. A blanker whiteness of benighted snow with no expression, nothing to express. The snow is still falling, and soon it's going to be all white with nothing there, nothing at all, nothing to express. And so he who has just told us that he's absent-spirited, he has nothing to express, because I think, I'm pushing a little hard, I think he has the loneliness within him, and there's nothing to express. It's empty too. And then one of the most marvelous rhymes of the 20th century. I can't believe he did this. I mean, in some ways it's childish, in other ways, only a great, great poet could have done this. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars, on stars where no human race is. You got that? Spaces, race is, woo, pretty amazing. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars, on stars where no human race is. So he's thinking of interstellar space, and there's no life on the stars out there, and in between the stars in that interstellar space, there's no life there either. It's all empty. It's all a desert. It's all without life. It's all alone out there. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. And I think that last line is symbolic, and it refers in 2 directions. It refers to the desert place that is this field that fills up with snow that scares him because it's nothing but whiteness. And as Melville said, all that whiteness makes him think that there's nothing there. It's the immensity overwhelms him of that whiteness, not in interstellar spaces, but right here in the fields. But I think it's also within him. He says to scare myself with my own desert places. And I think he's thinking about, I'm too absent spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares. His spirit is absent, and what he really has is an inner loneliness that overwhelms. That's the wrong word. Underwhelms him. I mean, Emily Dickinson said, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then he's dropping down into his own inner loneliness. Just as the field itself is lonely, and we don't have to go out into outer space to discover loneliness. We can find it within ourselves. We're moving right along. This poem is actually in Terza Rima. Terza Rima was the rhyme scheme of Dante. The whole of the Divine Comedy is written in Terza Rima. You can see it here: A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C. These are 3-line stanzas. D, A, D, and then it should be D, E, D, but he's going to bring back that original rhyme from the A and end up with 2 A's to tie it off. So it's in Terza Rima with a strange couplet ending that rhymes with the middle term of this 4th stanza. As I say, almost no 2 poems are the same. The guy is always experimenting. It's really amazing what he can do. I went a little quickly earlier, so I'm going to stop here for a second. Frost was born in San Francisco, moved to Massachusetts, and taught school and was a farmer in New Hampshire. And he sold his house and his farm and got some money together and went to England because it was easier to perhaps to get published there. I don't know, because maybe that's where Americans look to for how to learn poetry. I mean, it's amazing. This New England poet went to England to become a poet. And when in England, he met this strange red-haired guy named Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound had earlier barged in on a man named William Butler Yeats, who was the greatest English language poet of the time. He said, "Hey, I have something to tell you. I can make your poetry better." And to Yeats's credit, he said, "Okay, what do you have to tell me?" And they went off to a stone house in the countryside, and lo and behold, Yeats became a better poet. And Pound had another friend named T.S. Eliot, and Eliot wrote a poem, had a breakdown, wrote a poem, went to Paris. He said, "Ezra, I got this poem I'm writing." And Eliot went on to Zurich and saw the psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, came back to Paris. Pound said, "Yeah, that poem is pretty good, but it needed a lot of editing, so I cleaned it up." And he cut out about half of it. And that poem is A Wasteland. The edited poem that Pound edited, which is the most influential poem of the 20th century. And it's dedicated to Ezra Pound, Il Miglior Fabbro, the better maker. So Pound worked with Eliot, but he also worked with Frost. And he taught Frost how to write poems that dealt with facticity, of you could feel tangible things in them. And he taught him how to make it new in his own fashion, which, as I said, will be through varying rhyme schemes. In this poem, we have Terza Rima with this ending, tying things off. This is about the night. And I think I read it wrongly for a while. I think we have to see that the first stanza is about walking out into the countryside, and the next 2 stanzas are walking out into the night in and around a city. So they're wherever you go, he encounters night. I've been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. I've outwalked the furthest city light. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I've passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. Let me stop you here and just have you look at, I think maybe you learned this from Whitman. You can have rhyme at the beginning of lines, right? I, have. I mean, it's astonishing. It's called parallelism of these phrases. And it's a pretty amazing. The guy's a good poet. It seems to go without saying, but it doesn't, you know. And their uh, sentences, the first four sentences end with a period. The fifth sentence goes on two lines and has a period, not at the end of a sentence. And that's a very strange line. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. And I'm not sure those lines are explicable. That is it shame or guilt for what he has done or for being out in the night? Or is it embarrassment about being out in the night? Or we don't know, but somehow he drops his eyes. It's a gesture, and he can't explain it. And then we go to the next lines. I have stood still and stopped the cry of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. And I'm going to skip over this to go to what I think is an illusion. It may not be. It may not be. I may be pushing it too far, but this is the most famous poem about a cry in the night that probably any of us know, and it's by the poet William Blake, written in the late 18th century. It's about the city of London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every barn, man, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How this chimney sweeper's cry every blackening church appalls, and the hopeless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. And this is the cry that I think resonates most deeply. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plague the marriage hearse. Let me read that again with my glasses on. I read it better. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we'll go back, if we can, to the cry he hears, and he doesn't respond in this. There's a cry. When far away, an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. It's a cry of distress, anger, violent crime, maybe even passionate sex. Who knows it? But it's a cry, and he's disembodied from it. He's acquainted with the night and the things that go on at night, and I think acquainted with the difficulties of the city that Blake refers to in that poem. When far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye, and further still at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky, and that clock can either be a clock high on a steeple that he sees lit at night, or it could be the moon up there in the sky. And further still at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I've been one acquainted with the night. Again, I think this is a symbolic poem. What the night is, I don't know, and I can't tell you. And I don't think he wants us to specify. It's the night, it's the darkness. Last poem was about whiteness. This is about darkness, but they augur the same thing. Something that is deep and maybe destructive. Neither wrong nor right. It's just the way things are. Remember that first poem we did, or the second poem really? It was lovely, dark and deep. This is the darkness, and he's acquainted with it. And That's what he tells us. He's been acquainted with it, harsh as it may be. Another sonnet, this is called Design. This is a heel they grow in Vermont all over the place in fields. They're little blue flowers, and here's a heel up close. And there are three characters in this drama, and they're going to be delineated in the first 3 or maybe 4 lines. There's a heel that has turned it's not blue, it's somehow blighted. He's going to suggest it's white. And there's a white spider, which seems scary and insidious. And there's a dead moth, a white-winged moth that's caught up in the spider's web and has died in it. And so there's the heel, and there's a spider. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel, holding up a moth like a white piece of rigid satin cloth. So in a simile there, right? Like a white piece of cloth. And what he tells us is these are assorted characters of death, right? That moth is dead, and blight, which is what happened to the flower to turn it from blue and innocent he'll tell us on the next page, turn it from blue or purple into white, and the spider, which weaves a web to capture and kill things, so it's an agent of death. Assorted characters of death and blight, mixed ready to begin the morning rite, like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a snowdrop spider, a flower like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. And I think the words that summarize these characters are the characters of death and blight that we have here. Pardon me, I made it skip. And there are really only 3 characters, and he repeats them twice. Spider, white heel, a moth. And then he says, like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a spider, a flower, and dead wings of the moth. So it's repeated twice. Assorted characters of death and blight. How did they come to be here? Yes. And how come this is how I start my day? Mixed ready to begin the morning rite. This is a sonnet. First half is Petrarchan, right? A, B, B, A, B, B, A. The second half is, it begins with an A again. And it goes A, C, A, C, C. Again, he's experimenting all over the place. What had that flower, the heel, which should heal all? Except now it's blighted and dead or desiccated. What had that flower to do with being white, the wayside blue and innocent heel all? What brought the kindred spider to that height, that steered the white moth thither in the night? What a design of darkness to appall, if design governed in a thing so small. Amazing final line, isn't it? I mean, of course design governs in a thing so small. Why else are they there? Why did the moth get steered there? Why did the spider climb the stem of the plant? Why did the flower get blighted and die? That's kind of the natural law of things. And it pertains everywhere, not only in the large, the boy getting his hand cut off, but also in the small, this witch's brood that he sees, the mixed characters of death and blight. This is not a very happy poet. I don't think there's enough time to go through birches, which I love because I loved it when I was young, and because here are some pictures of birches. And here you see the birches in the front of the picture are bent by the ice storm, and the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, as you'll discover in a line from Wallace Stevens next time. There the birches, they're bent down and they stay down by ice storms. their birches bent down by a nice storm. And we had, as a few of us were talking before class began, we had a huge ice storm here in Vermont in 1999 in Vermont and all of New England and Montreal. And birches were bent down by the ice storm. Uh, ice ice storms happen when the temperature is below freezing and it rises and rain falls and hits the already cold uh, branches and turns to ice because they're so cold. And I'm not going to really go through this, but I wish I had the time, but I don't. But it's about two kinds of visions of why the birches are bent down. You will read it for yourselves. And what I'd like you to notice, what is an astonishment to me, is how poetic, full of imagery, his description of the natural world of fact is. So the fact turns into something quite beautiful in the first half of the poem. Ice storms do things. It's not a boy swinging on them, it's ice storms. Often you must have seen them loaded with ice a sunny winter morning after a rain. They click them on themselves as the breeze rises, then turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. I mean, they are so beautiful as they turn prismatic as the sun hits them. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching, onomatopoetic in the extreme, on the snow crust, such heaps of broken glass to sweep above you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. He's talking about the ice storm, and he's talking about it in extraordinary poetic language. The metaphor here is the broken ice on the ground from the trees is like heaven has fallen, and its crystalline dome is shattered at our feet. And then he says, the ice storm bends them over, and that's how they stay. And again, we get this unbelievably poetic description of the factual. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground, like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. Whew. That's what the trees look like. Girls throwing their hair ahead of them to dry in the sun. But as I was going to say, when Truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, yeah, right? He hasn't been matter of fact at all. Ice storms do bend on birches, but he has dealt with it not as matter of fact, but through poetic devices. And he says, I'd like to think a boy has been swinging them, a boy who grew up far from town where he could play baseball. And one by one, he subdued his father's trees by writing them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them, and not one but had held limp, not one was left for him to conquer. And the boy learns everything there is about climbing trees and launching out and coming down to the ground and letting go and letting the trees swing back. I tried to do this when I was young. I don't think you can swing birches so easily. It's not quite as easy as. And here too, he uses some. Oops, I did that wrong. Some poetic language with the same. He climbs carefully with the same pains used to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. That's pretty good, but it's not like the girls throwing their hair over their head. It's astonishing. This is narrative. What came before was fact, but the fact was imaginatively construed. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. And this is the culmination of the poem. I'll deal with this, and then we'll do one more poem, and then we shall end. It's when I'm weary of considerations, and life is too much like a pathless wood, where your face burns and tinkles with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from the twigs having lashed across it open. Life beats us up, and we would like to escape from all these beatings and this wandering around in the woods that have no path, where we get scratched and belted around.
He says, when that happens, I'd like to get away from Earth for a while. Yeah, we would like to get away from all those troubles and then come back to it and begin over. Oh, yeah. Fresh start. Don't we all want a fresh start? May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away, not to return. The half grant is I like to get away from Earth for a while and go upwards. Don't grant half of my wish. I'd like to come back. And then this line, I think, is if it didn't appear in a poem about boys swinging birches, we wouldn't be able to take it in. But it is a phenomenal line. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. So we have to come back. We can't just escape. We have to come back into that world. Again, we're in that pull from that first poem, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. We want to surrender to something else, but we have to come back. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. So I'd like to get away, but I know I'd come back. That would be good, both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches. This poem isn't quite like the others we've read. This is a poem about wanting to escape and also needing to come back. This is not quite the dark poet of who has his own desert places within, or who is acquainted with the night. This is a poet who comes back to the earth, even though he's had hard times with it. Now, we're going to end with this sonnet. This sonnet is in couplets. Let me just say a word about couplets. They're really out of favor. You know, every two lines, couplets means every two lines rhyme A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, E. It was a predominant mode of writing in the 18th century. And the great poet of couplets is Alexander Pope. And I think people look down on Pope. I think he was extraordinarily good at couplets. No, I think he's a great poet. I say that begrudgingly, but I think he is. What the 20th century discovered is you could write couplets, and if you used what's called enjambment, if you went past the end of the line and into the next line, the couplets could be there, structure in the poem, but also disappear because the lines were not what's called end stop. You didn't end with the second line, A, stop, B, stop. And so I think if you are an attentive reader, you'll find that an enormous amount of poetry in Yeats or Auden is in fact in couplets. Eliot, couplets are all over the place. They're just handled differently without that, what I call end stopping that we're accustomed to in the 18th century. Now, these are end stopped couplets for the most part. And he's standing by the Pacific, right? It's called Once by the Pacific, and he's watching these huge swells that have crossed from Japan over a whole ocean, and they're banging on the land. It's not hospitable for easy swimming like the East Coast is. And he watches the waves pound on the cliff, and he thinks, those are big waves. They're going to knock down the shore. It's good there are cliffs there. And he thinks, it's good, the cliffs are backed by continent. But what he notices is that powerful destructive force that is ongoing and oncoming. And even a continent is not enough to withstand them, I think, in this poem. There are two lines I don't understand. The clouds were low and hairy, and the skies like locks blown forward in the gleam of eyes. I try to make sense of them, but I can't quite fit them into the poem. So let me confess, instead of skipping over them, that I have trouble with those lines. The shattered water that's the waves breaking, made a misty din, and the mist is of the water breaking. Great waves looked over others coming in. wave after wave. One can see them, swells after swells, and thought of doing something to the shore that water never did to land before. They're really going to crash on the land like water has never done. They're going to erode it. The clouds were low and hairy in the skies, like locks blown forward in the gleam of eyes. You could not tell, and yet it looked as if the shore was lucky in being backed by cliff. The cliff in being backed by continent. Boy, it's lucky. These waves are so ferocious and so destructive. It's good there are cliffs behind the shore and continent behind the cliffs. But it looked as if a night of dark intent was coming, and not only a night, an age. Someone had better be prepared for rage. As he looks at these waves, he thinks he sees nothing but destructiveness, and it's going to keep coming and keep coming. It was coming in not only a night, an age, and there's this destructive, ferocious, raging waves coming in. There would be more than ocean water broken, not only those waves breaking, before God's last put out the light was spoken. You remember your Bible, of course. In the beginning of the Bible, God, in Genesis, God said, "Let there be light," and it was good. Yeah, well, here, God said, "Let's put out the light." So this is a vision of a world that is destructive and implacable, and that will destroy not only cliffs and continents, but the American nation we know, and we ourselves. This is an apocalyptic poem. It seems to me a way to think about our own times and about how rage and destruction could wipe us out. I'm not saying that Frost is commenting on modern American politics. It's just this dark side of Frost that sees darkness and night and the allure of the dark forest, and the fact that death occurs and life goes on as it out. He sees that night and desert places ultimately can and maybe will overwhelm us, that maybe that is the way the universe is composed. If I can return at the very end here to the physics with which I started, there is a sense that maybe the universe among physicists will run out of the energy that propels it onward and will collapse on itself. I don't know. I don't want to go too far with that. But this is a very dark poem, and we'll end with the dark poem. And I hope I haven't taken away from you that Robert Frost, who is smiling, reading at Kennedy's inauguration with great hope and faith. So thank you very much. And next time we'll do Wallace Stevens, who is, I would say, not as hard as Robert Frost. He's reputed to be very, very difficult, and you may find some of his poems difficult. And I'll send those poems out this evening. I would say the first poem is mainly to mark him out as a New England poet. It's called Farewell to Florida. You don't have to read that too carefully. The other poems we'll talk about at some length. So I wish you a good week, and
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Huck. Wonderful
Thank
program.
you.
It was hard. I tell you, this Frost
Thank
is
you.
a tough guy. Peter's
Thanks very
not
much.
He's a tough guy, you know, and he demands a lot of us. You'll like Wallace Stevens, who is difficult. I mean, really difficult, and yet not as difficult as Frost. I mean, that's the mystery of things. Anyway, all the best to everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
That's really good. I think you're everything.
So I'm going to end this, okay? And
Okay.
and we'll talk next time about Wallace Stevens. The poems are coming tonight. Bye.
Bye.